Hey there! Unit 4 is all about poetry. So in order for us to really talk about poetry, we need to know the lingo. So this video is going to focus on the lingo. We're going to take a look at all the vocab words that you need to know to read, understand, and discuss poetry. In this video, we are going to define elements of poetry, such as rhyme scheme and speaker. We'll define poetic forms and structures, such as iambic pentameter, sonnet, and free verse. And hopefully you'll be taking some notes that you can use in our next class Connect. Poetry is writing that takes the form of lines and uses figurative language, imagery, and rhythm to convey an idea or emotion. Poetic form refers to the different shapes that a poem and its lines can take. Poets will choose to use different poetic forms based on what they want to express and how they can most effectively express that. For example, sometimes a short and structured form is the ideal method, whereas other times a long and free-flowing form is better suited to the poet's purpose. So poets use different forms for different reasons. Over here are a couple of definitions for you to remember. Form is the appearance of the words on the page. Line is a group of words together on one line of the poem. And stanza is a group of lines arranged together. It's kind of like a poetic paragraph. Over here we have two stanzas. Right here it says, "A word is dead when it is said, some say. I say it just begins to live that day." So in this example we have two separate stanzas. So even though they're each a sentence long, you have two separate stanzas. Another word that we're going to be using frequently in this unit is speaker. Speaker is the voice in a poem. It's not the author necessarily, but it's the persona that the author is writing as. So it's very similar to a narrator in a short story or novel. In this example, which is a poem by Edgar Allan Poe, it says, "It was many and many years ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me." So in this example, we know that the speaker is somebody who's in love with Annabel Lee. So it's not the author necessarily. Instead, the author has kind of taken on this persona that they are writing from. Another word that we're going to be using a lot to discuss poetry is repetition. Repetition is when words, phrases, or lines are repeated for emphasis. You see this a lot in the music that you listen to. Oftentimes a chorus will be repeated and repeated and repeated because they want you to remember that part of the song. They want it to get stuck in your head, and oftentimes that's a part that really holds a lot of meaning. So poets use that same strategy in poems. Metaphor is another tool that poets like to use. Metaphor is a comparison between two unlike things. It does not use the words like or as, and it usually says that one thing is another. A metaphor can be one line, or it can be expressed over the course of multiple lines in an extended metaphor. And I have an example of that right here. This is a poem by Carl Sandburg. It says, "The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on." So in this poem, the poet doesn't directly say that the fog is a cat, but if you read the poem, you can see the comparison being made between the two. Simile is another tool that poets like to use. A simile is a comparison between two unlike things. And when using a simile, you do use the words like or as. For example, runs like a gazelle or not as tall as a giant. Another word that's good to know as we move through this poetry unit is personification. Personification is when the poet gives human qualities to something that is not human. For example, the car danced across the icy road. Now we know that a car can't really dance. It's not doing the samba across the icy road. But when an author uses that, it helps us picture what's going on. So when I read that line, I can actually see that car kind of swerving back and forth across the icy road. So poets use that to help you build a clearer picture in your head of what they're describing. Imagery is when the author uses the five senses to help you build a picture in your head. And this is one we've probably talked about quite a bit already in the course this semester. So whenever the author or the poet is trying to make you see something or smell something or hear something, they're using imagery. Onomatopoeia is when a word represents an actual sound. And this one can be really fun to use and to read. For example, all of these over here, these are all examples of onomatopoeia. So words like quack or slurp or bzz, those are all onomatopoeia. They're sound words. Hyperbole is another tool that poets like to use, especially in humorous poetry. And a hyperbole is an extreme exaggeration. So whenever you come across an extreme exaggeration, something that is not possible at all, that would be hyperbole. So a lot of times you'll see that in Dr. Seuss books, or if you ever read that old book of poetry, I think it was called Where the Sidewalk Ends. All of those are really good examples of hyperbole. Meter in a poem is the rhythm. So whenever you hear us talking about meter in class, we're really talking about the beat, the rhythm of the poem. Meter is a stressed and unstressed syllabic pattern in a verse or within the lines of a poem. It gives the poetry a rhythm or melodious sound. This is an example of a limerick. A limerick has a really set meter. The first two lines have 3 beats, the next two have 2, and the last have 3. So as I'm reading it, I want you to listen for those beats. There was an old man in a boat who said, I'm afloat, I'm afloat. When they said, no you ain't, he was ready to faint, that unhappy old man in a boat. So as I was snapping through the poem, you could hear the rhythm, you could hear the beat or the meter. Another one that we talk about frequently when we talk about poems, and it's probably the one that pops up in your head when you hear the word poetry, is rhyme scheme. Rhyme scheme is a pattern of rhyme made by the final words or sounds of the lines. And we always use the alphabet to label rhyme scheme. So in this poem it says, the people along the sand all turn and look one way. They turn their back on the land, they look at the sea all day. We would say that these first 4 lines have an AB pattern. A is assigned to the word sand, and then we see it again down here with the word land. Because those both rhyme, they both get an A. Way and day rhyme, so they both get a B. Another thing that poets like to use are rhyming couplets. You see rhyming couplets a lot in sonnets. Rhyming couplets are when you have 2 lines, one right after the other, that rhyme. They're a couple. So 2 lines together that rhyme are considered a rhyming couplet. Here's an example here. It says, tell me if you think you know how to make a turtle go. So know and go both rhyme, so they'd be a rhyming couplet. In last week's video, you got an introduction to poetry and you learned a little bit about sonnets. So I don't want to go into too much details, but we are going to be reading sonnets through Unit 4. So just to review, a sonnet is a 14-line poem. Typically it's written in iambic pentameter, and it follows the same rhyme scheme. There are also 3 main types of sonnets. Now remember, and they'll explain this in the online lessons, but iambic pentameter refers to the meter of a poem. Lines of poetry written in iambic pentameter contain 10 syllables made up of 5 iambs. So basically they have 5 beats in the line. Free verse, on the other hand, is the opposite of that. Free verse is a poetic form that has no regular meter, so no beat, no regular rhyme scheme. It reflects the rhythms of regular natural speech. Free verse often uses figurative language and repetition to create a more free-flowing musical effect. It's different than blank verse, which has no rhyme scheme but does have a regular meter. Figurative language, it includes devices such as metaphor, simile, personification, all of those terms that we've all talked about. Those are all encompassed in figurative language. This is an example of free verse, and we actually read this poem at the beginning. It says, "The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on." So no regular rhythm, no rhyme scheme. The last term that you should be familiar with is blank verse. Blank verse poetry is written in lines of iambic pentameter like a sonnet, but it doesn't rhyme. Okay, I think that I have summed up the terms that we're going to be using in this unit. Make sure that you've taken notes on the ones that you were unfamiliar with and that you're ready for our Class Connect. Thank you for watching.